Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Asian Dramaturgs Network, or ADN. My name is Charlene Rajendran, and I'm one of the co-directors of ADN. I'm based in Singapore, where I live and work. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from, and thank you very much for joining us. We're really delighted to have you here on this online discussion to respond to ADN Review Volume 1. It's been a while since we've had an ADN event due to the changes that life in COVID-19 has wreaked on us. But we hope it won't be too long before we meet again, not just online, but in person somehow. I'm here to briefly introduce ADN to you before handing over to Corrie Tan, who's our moderator for today's discussion, and our three panelists, Ness, Roque, Nanako, Nakajima, and Peter Eckersall. So what is ADN, or Asian Dramaturgs Network? Very briefly, it's a platform for gathering practitioners who are interested in dramaturgy and the role of the dramaturg across the Asia-Pacific region. In 2016, our founding director, Lim Hao Nien, who's currently based in Australia, collaboratively conceptualized this idea with Centre 42, which is our principal organizing partner, and held the inaugural ADN Symposium in May that year at 42 Waterloo Street, a venue in Singapore, which was at the time Centre 42 venue. This was possible because of funding from Asia Centre Japan Foundation and the National Arts Council of Singapore. Since 2016, ADN has hosted 7 other events, twice in Yokohama, once in Adelaide, Jakarta, and then back to Singapore in 2019. And we've had speakers and participants from very mixed contexts that not just mean different countries, but also people from established institutions and collectives, as well as freelancers and individuals, scholars, practitioners, researchers, performers, anyone interested in the terrain. So ADN Review is an e-publication that harnesses the insights, the stories, the perspectives and ideas that have emerged in these sessions or from these sessions. And we wanted to make them more available, more accessible, because we recognize that perhaps listening to a long recording online might not work for many people. And while we recognize the limitations of it only being in one language, which is English at the moment, nonetheless, we felt it was worth doing. So with my co-editors, Daniel Teo, Chong Gua Ki, and Dominic Na, we've extracted some parts of the discussion that we think most useful and relevant to ongoing discussions. And we hope that these will feed into other dialogues and raise new questions which need to be asked. We're pleased to say that Volume 1 has thus far been downloaded 290 times in 20 different locations worldwide. And we hope this will continue. We will be putting together 2 more volumes before the end of this year. And this has been made possible with support from the National Arts Council of Singapore. So today's discussion is an opportunity to keep that dialogue moving and to update it as well, perhaps, because some of these ideas were hatched about 5 years ago and may have changed since. The publication is not meant to be definitive, but generative or suggestive of ways to move the work and the discussions forward. So we really welcome your views during this discussion. And if you'd like to send us your thoughts, please do so on email as well, as some of you may be listening to a recording of this and not able to listen to it live. So thank you very much for being here. And over to you, Corrie.
All right, thank you so much, Charlene, for giving us the overview of ADN so far. Really, thank you so much to everyone for joining us here today, this evening or morning, depending on where you are. I'm Corrie. I will be very lightly and very gently facilitating this session. It's quite cozy. I think I see many familiar faces in the room. Really glad to see all of you again. And possibly, I might be enacting or summoning this dramaturgical figure in some way through accompanying the speakers or provoking them, maybe. And I'm going to kind of introduce you to the structure that we're going to work through. But first of all, I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers, all of whom are affiliated with ADN and have participated in its various symposiums, meetings, and labs over the past 5 years. So we have Nanako Nakajima. Hi, Nanako. She's a scholar and dance dramaturg, a visiting professor at the Free University of Berlin. Her dramaturgy work includes Meng Fan Wang's piece with Aging Dancers from 2019 and the Dance Archive Box Berlin in 2020. Nanako received the 2017 Special Commendation of Elliot Hayes Award for Outstanding Achievement in Dramaturgy from the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. And she's been with ADN in 2016 at the very inaugural symposium that they held, and also in Yokohama in 2017. And then we have Ness Roque, who's an actor, dramaturg, and educator from the Philippines. She was a core member of the Manila-based performance company, Supat Lawin Ensemble, and she's part of Project Artist Community, which is an interdisciplinary collective that integrates participatory art and research practices, community engagement, and education. And Ness is currently a grad student at the Tokyo University of the Arts doing her graduate degree. She was also at ADN in 2017 and 2019. And finally, we have Peter Eckersall. He teaches at the Graduate Center, CUNY. He's the author and editor of many publications, so many I will just name a few, including Curating Dramaturgies, the Routledge Companion to Theatre and Politics, and New Media Dramaturgy. He's also the co-founder and dramaturg of Not Yet It's Difficult, which is a group of artists in Australia who collaborate on the production of interdisciplinary projects. He was also at the inaugural 2016 symposium and at ADN 2017 in Yokohama. So it's really nice to see a convergence of people who have worked with ADN across the past 5 years. And finally, hi everyone, I'm Corrie. I'm currently doing my PhD in theatre studies at the National University of Singapore and King's College London. In my other work, I'm a recovering theatre critic. I'm a facilitator, educator. I'm a dramaturg for the long-term performance project Tactility Studies with Guaki this year and Berners-Lee in Singapore. And I'm very indebted to ADN, especially Charlene, Robin, and Haonian, for throwing me into the deep end for dramaturgy and beginning my journey. So really glad to be here today. So I'm just going to walk you through, this is how our session will go today. So Peter, Ness, and Nanako will each present on a specific topic, responding to ADN Review Vol.1. And they'll speak for about 10 to 12 minutes each. So Peter will go first. He'll address our theme on mapping. Ness will explore on Asian. And Nanako will conclude on inter/intra. And after that, there will be a quick conversation between myself and the speakers. We'll go for about 20 minutes. I may ask some questions. The speakers may ask each other some questions. And then we'll open up the session to the floor for everyone's questions and other responses from the audience. So you can feel free to type your question in the chat if you prefer. If you really want to, we can also probably invite you to speak at certain points. And then after that, when we wrap, we'll end with some exciting announcements by our host, Center 42. And that will be it for the night. So we hope to wrap by maybe 10 o'clock at the very latest. But yes, I think I've spoken enough. So let's maybe begin with Peter.
Thank you, everyone. And it's really lovely to see you all. Good morning from New York. It's a bit early here, so I'm just trying to wake up a little bit. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in, what is a wonderful ongoing event. I think ADN is one of the high points of the last decade of theatre and theatre theory, I think, and something that I think I'm very pleased to be a part of, but also something that I think is very generative and producing some really exceptionally good work. So congratulations to all of you who've been involved. I've been asked to speak to mapping, and I'm going to do a kind of PowerPoint here and speak to this PowerPoint a little bit. What I want to talk about today is thoughts about mapping and dramaturgy. And I'm really trying to do two things in this short presentation. One is to bring some perspectives on mapping to the project and to the way that the issue of the magazine has been dramaturged or thought about in curatorial terms. But secondly, to think about how mapping itself is a really strong dramaturgical practice and has a long history in contemporary performance making And in addressing that, I'm going to begin with some theoretical perspectives, move to some examples from the region, and then try and do a kind of very provisional and very early attempt at bringing some of the vectors in that we might think about if we were to map the formation of ADN. So firstly, I think we need to acknowledge the influence of Cathy Turner and Cinna Bern's work on Dramaturgy and Performance, that 2007 book. But here I'm actually referring to Cathy's later book from 2015 called Dramaturgy and Architecture, where she talks about the idea of a spatialized dramaturgy. Those of you who know Cathy's work know that it deals a lot with performance in public spaces, and sight is a very important part of that work. And I think she gives us a kind of helpful introduction into thinking about the way in which mapping spaces is also something that relates to performance. And she uses the concept of archaeotectronics in relation to that to bring a focus on the conceptualization and production of space. We should also, I think about dramaturgy as a field. And here we'd be citing Hans Lehmann and Eleanor Fuchs as inspiration, the need to consider theatre as a three-dimensional art form, where narratives are implicated in visual, physical, and spatial structures. So you can see the way in which we're beginning to address the concept of dramaturgy as a kind of mapping exercise and a kind of spatial exercise. A couple of other perspectives from Eleanor Fuchs and Una Chowdhury in 2002, and that remarkable text, Landscape Theatre, in which terms landscape, territory, geography, and map are introduced to the way that we can think about and theorize, and also think dramaturgically about making theatre. Of course, a lot of this work owes a debt to Henri Lefebvre's work, The Production of Space, a kind of sociological or dramaturgical recognition of the production of space as a sociological phenomena, and a key work in bridging the use of dramaturgy in relation to the arts with dramaturgy as a social formation, talking about the dramaturgy of events outside of theatre, such as political protests or sporting events, for example. And then the final introduction here is some language from Hans Lehmann's The Post-Dramatic Theatre, where he talks about staging landscapes beyond dramatic action, ceremony, voices in space, landscape. And I think this keyword landscape is something that I want to bring forward in our discussion today, because for me, it's a very helpful way in thinking about the kind of environment or the way we talk about a theatrical space as a full space, a space that is full of these kind of mapping possibilities, but also with the focus on landscape, it takes us immediately to environment and concerns about climate and our need to care for the planet. And so I think that there's a really valuable way of bringing some very important existential political questions and into the discussion of mapping. So very rushed and very compressed, pointing to a couple of literary contexts or theoretical contexts for the discussion of mapping. But in general, I think these texts are very well known to people who work in theatre studies or performance studies at least. And if you don't, these are all, I think, key foundational texts in our field and have helped us think about how we get to a kind of mapping as a critical tool, but also as a dramaturgical tool. I want to turn now to some maps of and in contemporary Japanese theatre and visual arts. And here I'm trying to bring this question of mapping to a more regional connection. As those of you who know me know that I work a lot on contemporary Japanese theatre. My training was in Japanese studies. So these examples are from Japan, but they're examples, I think, that have a much wider application to the possibility of mapping in relation to dramaturgy and theatre in the region. And of course, in situating these maps, we can also look at maps in Western contemporary visual arts that are common now. I've seen certain mapping exercises done in China, for example, in exhibitions there. And, you know, this is an exercise in trying to, in some ways, join dots and put together different alternative ontologies for the production of work, acknowledging figures who might be left out, otherwise left out of kind of more formal mapping processes or more hegemonic mapping processes. And also they draw attention to the circulation of subcultures, regional cultures, networks, and so on. So the first one, and I think really for me, the most important one in terms of my understanding of mapping in relation to the ADN production, is Uchino Tadashi's Mapping Zapping J Theatre at the Moment, which was published in 2006 and then was republished in his book Crucible Bodies in 2009. In this essay, Uchino attempts to map the contemporary Japanese theatre along a number of different vectors, and you probably can't see the detail there, but this is a very interesting attempt to create what Uchino-san calls a cognitive map of what is happening in Japan's theatre culture at the present, conceptualized in terms of 4 planes, the zone of activities, what he calls zones of activities and influence. Each is discussed in terms of key events, influences, questions, and forms. And these planes are the Seinen-dan school, or the return to Shingeki. Shingeki is the Japanese way of describing the modern Western drama. Plane B is called the Little Theatre, which refers to small so-called underground or contemporary theatre groups. The plane C is contemporary dance, and plane D is the return to Angura. And Angura is a word that comes from the English word underground and refers to the kind of very avant-garde or radical Japanese theatre from the 1960s. So this is a kind of model of a dramaturgy, of an analysis of a field of production, which I think is very formative and informative of our current understanding of mapping. To look back into the 60s and to the Angura period, this is a different kind of map produced by Theatre 6870 Black Tent that was published in their magazine Dojidai Engeki and also reproduced in David Goodman's production Concern Theatre Japan. And this is a touring guide for a Japanese company that artistic director is Sato Makoto, who I think is a person known to many of you. And it's a way of illustrating how a theatre company can imagine itself as a mobile traveling company with a tent on the back of 2 trucks. And, you know, this is kind of a map, but it's also a set of instructions for, you know, how to make your theatre reach a wider audience. And it's obviously about motion and mobility and so on. The final one here is not from theatre so much, but from the sort of intersection of theatre, performance art, and visual arts. And this is Akasegawa Genpei, Minari Nobuhiro, and Masada Tetsuo. It's an image, all hell breaks loose, data kids take control, great battles of the world in Geijutsu, which is, Geijutsu is a way of describing contemporary Japanese art from late 50s through to the 1980s, perhaps, but very much focused on this very innovative and very formative period of Japanese art in the 1960s. And this is a map of all of the key players in, well, not all of them, but a lot of the key players in that small concentrated circle of artists and groups mainly in Tokyo, but also in other major cities and some regional. You can see in many of the figures from the 1960s there, sometimes capturing their very particular idiosyncratic kinds of work. And in the background, you see some of the cultural references and historical references, figures who are known to be certain politicians. You can see the image of the Dai Japanese Parliament, which was the site of many protests in the 1960s, in the background, and so on. This is a very well-known image, but I think it shows the kind of potential that we have for understanding these networks and these kind of processes. So my final, sorry, one more, also iconic is from Terayama Shuji and Kishiro Ryo's 1975 production Knock, which was a well-known immersive theatre project that took place over a weekend. For the price of the ticket, you were given a map. The map had a series of places that you would go to at various times during the weekend and see particular theatricalized activities, some of which were more drama-based, some of which were more eccentrically dance-based or performance installation-based. Some happened indoors, some happened outdoors, and most famously was the scene that happened in a Japanese bathhouse where one entered a public bathhouse and only some of the people in the bathhouse were actually in the performance or attending the performance. There was a kind of classic mixing of performance and everyday life, which a lot of people have written about. So to that, if in the last 2 minutes I could think about, and here this is very provisional and perhaps very idiosyncratic, and maybe that's one thing to think about. Maps are idiosyncratic, they're very personal, and this is a certain, bringing some things, some vectors to the map of ADN. Certainly, I think for me anyway, new dramaturgy is Marianne van Kerkhoven's concept of a new kind of making dramaturgical practice that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s in Europe. I've already mentioned Kathy Turner and Sinna Bernst's dramaturgy and performance, and the rise of dramaturgical theory. Those of us who are a little bit older would know that if we were working in theatre in the 1980s, there was very little discussion of a word like dramaturgy. Most of us had really barely heard of the word. I think we should acknowledge Lim Hong Yin's PhD at the University of Singapore as a text that introduced some of the language and context for this topic to the Singapore landscape. I'd like to acknowledge Dramaturgies Australia, which was a project that I worked on with Melanie Betty and Paul Monaghan, where over a decade we produced a series of ADN-like events to introduce the kind of vectors of dramaturgy to the Australian theatre context. Contemporary theatre in the region and the changes that have taken place around a kind of new vision of contemporary performance. So moving from theatre to performance, and therein invoking a certain need for dramaturgy. Fuji Shintaro's dramaturgy project at Waseda University, I think, which was crucial in bringing a whole gamut of voices around contemporary dramaturgical practice into the Japanese contexts. Institutions, we've already mentioned some of them: Centre 42, Japan Foundation, TPAM, National Council of Arts in Singapore, National Arts Council in Singapore, and so on. The fact that a number of funding agents decided to make money available for these kind of events, I think, is an interesting vector to think about, not only in terms of the gratefulness we have for that support, but why did they choose to fund these events when they did? A similar argument could be made for the Australia Council in the early 2000s. Then I think we've got questions around the genres and styles and the need to try and relate classical theatre's ritual with contemporary performance. The dissemination of this work by festivals is also a kind of mapping vector. And of course, the inclusion of contemporary dance. And finally, I just wanted to acknowledge the long-term and deep roots of discussion around theory and practice in the Singaporean arts context, connected to by things like PSI Singapore 2004, but also the constant attention to the arts community and publications and debate about theory and practice that has been a feature of the Singaporean arts community for at least 2 decades. This is not something that we should take for granted. It's something that I think has been, particularly important. The fact that it's been produced within that kind of hothouse of the Singapore environment. So there are just some initial thoughts, and thank you for your time. And I look forward to hearing the other speakers and the discussion. So
thank you very, very much, Peter, for that kind of opening invocation. I really appreciated that. I think we often think of the map or cartography especially is a kind of authoritative practice, mapping the known and the unknown, or the stable. And I really appreciated that you were also paying attention to maybe the para-historical, things that, as you mentioned, don't come under the remit of hegemonies of map making, but mapping affective relationships or affinities. And I think a further questions to think about is, what goes unmarked or are left out of these maps, or maybe are rendered illegible to even those who are looking, right? What goes in between, or what are the desire paths that the maps do not chart, like different shortcuts between people. So I think it's also interesting to think about how if we think of Lefebvre and the production of space, that space is also a social construct. Social space is a social product, and that we are building the world as we are mapping it. So it's quite interesting that one kind of informs the other in this loop. So thank you for that opening invocation. And next we'll have Ness, who I think will bring us to look at and maybe challenge Asia.
Hi. So yeah, I will, before sharing some visuals that I have, I will just begin with an introduction. So hi, I'm Ness, and I'm currently studying in Tokyo and living in Yokohama. And before coming to Japan, I lived in Manila and in my hometown in Pampanga. And so I found it quite interesting how in the Philippines, Asian food marts or Asian groceries meant places where you could buy ingredients for Chinese, Japanese, or Korean cuisine. So it's primarily East Asia. And when I moved to Japan, Asian stores is where I would go to buy ingredients for Filipino cuisine. And that's also where I could buy Indonesian, Vietnamese, Indian, Thai ingredients. And so it feels funny to me how this switch is kind of flipped. And now that I am here in Japan, I think of myself as Asian, perhaps more than I used to. But to be honest, I don't really know what that actually means. And so, of course, the question of Asia is, as a construct, is huge and complex. And of course, this is also a question that we grapple with as we talk about Asia and Asian in the Asian Dramaturgs Network. So I thought perhaps I could apply some of the dramaturgical strategies that seem to be emerging within the conversations of ADN as captured in the zine. So I just wanted to take this as an exercise in dramaturgical thinking to see where it could lead us. So in the next few minutes, I will just show you my notes and I will take you with me as I briefly think through this idea of Asia and the Asian using the dramaturgical strategies that I found in the zine. So it is in no way exhaustive as well. So these are just some things that I extracted. Yeah, so some of the things that I noticed was that one of the dramaturgical strategies was thinking through translations. So as you could see in the cover as well, and yeah, as you could see in the cover as well, we think by translating the word dramaturgy as well. So thinking through translations, I was looking for translations of the word Asia in different Asian languages. And funnily enough, most of them are just variations of Asia, Asha, Asia, something. So so while I was finding this out, I was like, that's quite funny. Asia is just Asia almost everywhere in any language. Maybe this in some languages not, but anyway. And so I had to look through the etymology of Asia, of course, and then it comes from the Greek word Asia as well. And yeah, so it used to refer to eastern, what is east of Greece, and then it just meant as the Western thinkers began to expand their idea of the world, they just started calling everything else beyond as Asia. And then it kind of just stuck, right? So I probably knew this from high school, but forgot it already. So anyway, so this is just something that I was going through. And then of course, while doing this, I am thinking through epistemologies, thinking through this idea of Asia as an evolving, as a really, really old idea, and that has been evolving for so long. And of course, we are part of this narrative. So I'm not really sure where that strategy led me to. So I will just scroll to the next strategy that I did, which is what I noticed was the strategy of thinking through mediation. So a lot of times in the zine, a lot of dramaturgs were talking about how the role of the dramaturg is to translate the metaphor of dramaturg as a bridge, to mediate different cultures, mediate different languages, different ways of working, and different ways of thinking. And so when I was thinking of mediation in terms of thinking through Asia, I kind of apply this through this idea of when we talk about Asia, we have to mediate so many structures and contexts, because for some people, when they talk about Asia, they are coming from a geographical or geological context of tectonic plates and technical meanings of the land that is Asia, the land and the islands that comprise Asia. For some, when we talk about Asia, it's about cultures. For some, it's about identities. And so we have to negotiate and mediate between Asia as philosophy, Asia in international relations, Asia in cultural studies, Asia in Asian studies, or Asia as method, as they even call it. And I feel like as dramaturgs who work within Asian contexts, when we work in performances, we actually have to be conscious that we are actually treading or mediating these different lines. And so this goes to the next strategy that I noticed, which is thinking through doing. So finally, of course, dramaturgs don't just work with texts only, or just with the pen and paper. They are in rehearsal rooms, they are in theaters or in streets, or anywhere where a performance can happen. And so when I was thinking about dramaturgs and dramaturgies within the context of Asia, this is something that I found myself repeating. Like I wasn't sure if I could call myself like an Asian dramaturg or what is an Asian dramaturgy, but I felt like the safest phrase that I could come up with was like, we are dramaturgs and these are dramaturgies within the contexts of Asia. And so I feel like this word of contexts expands the idea of Asia in terms of our network of performance making. It includes the institutions that declare what Asia is, that fund what Asia is, the networks, the friendships that we have within this region, so also the relations. So I was just also thinking through this, thinking through my practice. I guess that's what thinking through doing means. Also, another strategy that repeats in the zine is the dramaturgical strategy of listening. And I would just share some things that I've listened to within the past month that kind of offer perhaps different transnational ideas or transnational solidarities. So, for example, recently I attended a talk by curator and writer Maria Pastor Roses called Post-Pandemic Futures, Reclaiming Our Narrative, Inclusivity and Decolonization. So she was talking about how we could also look at Austronesian language speaking people and the Austronesian language as a connecting point or a common culture or just a common history as well of this region. I was personally moved by this talk. She explains it better than I do, of course. But it's kind of like, I feel like for the longest time, I felt like thinking of myself within Asia and the Southeast Asian context was quite important for me as a maker and as a dramaturg. But then when I attended her talk, it kind of expanded it a little bit more. That I just realized that I by thinking too much of Asia and the Southeast Asian context, I kind of forgot to look at other possibilities of transnational solidarities and cultures. And so this was one offer from her. And then another talk that I attended was this Thinking from Asia, London Asia Art Worlds Conference by the Paul Mellon Center at Yale University, just last month as well. And they talk about Asia as a coordinate. And I'm not really sure yet what this exactly means. But what I get from this discussion that they had was, or what I get from this phrase Asia as a coordinate is like, it also expands our understanding of Asia beyond the geographical point, but like, for example, acknowledging the diaspora, the Asian diasporic communities that don't fall into the geographic lines of what is Asia today. So yeah, so this was something that I'm still kind of thinking about it. I wanted to share with everyone. And yeah, so this is how I kind of applied the zine and like the things that I read from there to think through the idea of Asia as well, and the Asian or Asians. And maybe I will just end my my brief talk with like the main question that I have after thinking through this. So maybe, yeah, my final question is, what are our roles as dramaturgs in counter mapping? So yeah, it also just like adding to that idea of dramaturgy as cartography, right? So what are our roles as dramaturgs in counter mapping, in creating, imagining post-colonial, decolonial, feminist, and queer presents and futures for within Asian contexts? And then I just added Asian performance or performative contexts. Yeah, so these are just like initial thoughts that I've had as I was thinking through this question of Asia within the context of ADN. Yeah, so thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Ness, for this. It was really wonderful to see you bring us through your thinking process with you. And actually something that really struck me was kind of your practice of annotation and annotating with or against the grain. And I often think of I have a dear friend called Nurul Huda Rashid, who often looks at how Muslim women are represented in popular culture. And one of her practices is to annotate those kind of anthropological ethnographic photographs that were taken of Malay women from this part of the world, and how they're posed for the violence of the camera, and how her act of kind of moving through these images and listening to these images is to annotate them and make marks and bring a new texture to the image that was first presented to us. So I really appreciate you kind of walking us through kind of taken for granted maps, like the way we position the geographic confines of Asia on a page, and to really reflect on how while we desire for Asia to be non-monolithic, maybe sometimes we just end up reifying or making it a monolith, right? And I often ask myself, like whenever we ask, what is Asia? I think about these inter-Asian debates. Do we end up reifying the concept, or do we allow some measure of translatability to other parts of the world? So I think that's been a current debate in inter-Asia discussions also, that maybe sometimes overprivileged North and East Asia over things like archipelagic Southeast Asia or Australasia. So I really appreciate you kind of destructing that thought process for us. Thank you very much. And finally, we have Nanako, who will look at inter and intra.
Hi, I'm Nanako Nakajima. Can you hear me? Yes, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very delighted to be here, and also like thankful for all the members of the ADN. And I also enjoy leading e-zines of ADN. So I'm very excited about how to present my comments on the part on inter. So I kind of combined it together with intra. So yes, I have many quotes from e-zines of ADN first. Yes, so my part about inter is titled as Navigating Liminality and Dramaturging the Inter. So all the discussions are so interesting, but I quote only a few parts of the discussions. And then this part is working on interproductions, interdisciplinary, the intercultural, and shades in between and across is often like trekking into uncharted lands. So this is already like kind of difficult part to get into. And I'm also in charge of intercultural dance projects very often. So I take some of the comments after into my own practice. So the dramaturg Ken Takiguchi from Japan, and also he was based in Singapore, Malaysia, and he introduces himself, his work as a dramaturg is about finding and filling gaps. And also he says, in the rehearsal room of intercultural theater, I think the translator will play a critical role to establish such a microcosms. This kind of conceptualizations of the translator / dramaturg makes very good sense to me, because I started my involvement in theater making as a translator and gradually acquired the role of dramaturg later in a very organic way. So the role of translator is somehow very essential in dramaturgical work in his case, and also in my case too. And he also mentions that there's the gaps between different generations. So after he did research on the project, and then he discovered that the perspectives of between Japanese and Malaysian, Singapore's are different. And so this gap is actually, this gap is about the intergenerational things. And I thought that was also interesting, that inter is not only intercultural, interdisciplinary, but also intergenerational. And that's because I'm also interested in age and aging. So this is the kind of the link to my interest. So I move forward. Yes. So Ness, yes, she just presented the talk. And then I also thought that that part of her speech is interesting to me. And she says, we cannot make a performance that asks the audience to be free and pray among themselves if the system of creating the work is not likewise. So a key point we have discovered is for everyone to have dual roles. I think her project in Philippines and also in Korea is to make ideal government. And it's so much about the collective dramaturgy. And what they did is kind of to have dual roles, not only as a director, but also as a performer. And also she plays a role of dramaturg, but also as a performer. So that the kind of mixing the roles in the project makes the situation more democratic and more kind of, not so much about power politics in art making. And I thought that's also important to me. And Charlene, I think like that part of Charlene's comments are also important and also significant to me. As she says, I want to propose that dramaturgs need to be good listeners, if not compulsive ones, that a large part of what dramaturgs do, particularly in interdisciplinary and intercultural work, is skilled listening. So she says a listening dramaturgy. And that's also listening. It was introduced by Ness in the previous presentation. And also Rustam Barucha talked about listening too. And what is also interesting to me is Charlene also in the earlier sections mentioned how to sit in the rehearsal studio and not how to speak in the rehearsal studio. And I think this attitude of quiet listening and quiet sitting it's very much connected, but still sitting and listening is not passive. It's more like a very active listening. And that's why I think she calls it as a skilled listening. And listening is also political. What is missed, what is not missed. And it's actually same as a translation. And then the one more things about Charlene's comments. Dramaturging the inter then refers not just to what lies between, betwixt, and among, but is about being in the midst of different voices, languages, texts, entities. So actually, like there are multiple voices in the project, and how to coordinate and design these different opinions and ideas and voices to be in the same project is how we work as a dramaturg in the project. And so I take all these interesting comments to, in my case of dramaturgy. So I go back to my own practice so that I can understand these comments further. And my work as dance dramaturg, I'm interested in aging. And I aim to theorize experiences of dramaturging creations and presentation projects with Asian dancers across Asia and also in Germany. And so this is also temporal things, but also age is not only about age, but also aging. So it's a process of getting older. And I organize different kinds of projects and also work as a dramaturg for some project which is related to age and aging. In Kyoto, in Japan, I organized a project of reconstructions of postmodern dance, Yvonne Rainer's piece, Trio A, but together with different aged artists. The performers and dancers are from their 20s to their 80s. And their dance backgrounds are different. So it's not only contemporary dance, but also No and Buto and other backgrounds. And he is also involved as a No performer of Kita School in Kyoto. And they dance together, that trio, postmodern dance. And in 2019, I just introduced the project with Vol.1, who is based in Beijing. And she has been working with the two retired revolutionary ballet dancers in China. And during the cultural revolutions, they are very active as a classic ballet dancer, or Chinese ballet dancers. But now they are aged or they are retired. And to come back to the stage is our project about age. And I also had a research on my this is the book. This is the top page of my book, but this is the hand of the Kazuo Ono, who has danced for a long time until even 100 years old. So, and my current ongoing project is with Peter Eckersall and Ukan Chen. And then this project has been, it's kind of continuous project. And then they have developed a piece about Ramayana together with 4 different dance masters in Asia. And so this is still like in process, and we are not ready for the premiere yet because of the pandemic, but the masters are actually the different age generations, and this is much about age and generational things, not only master and students relationship. So I take this first Takiguchi-san's input, conceptualizations of the translator dramaturg, into my own context as fluctuating identity politics, because it's also a dramaturg's role as opposed to researchers. Dramaturgs offer creative ideas and practical theory for the future rather than a scholarly analysis using pre-existing theory. And dramaturgs negotiate realities in the present time. We are not limited to recreating what happened in the past. So I think that's actually what's fascinating with the dramaturgs. We are making the future, not only doing the analysis, analyzing the piece. And in my case, by moving across continents and blurring the source and target cultures of my dramaturgical contributions, I aim to avoid a simple binary between native informant and local expert. Because I'm from traditional Japanese background, sometimes like I would be in a very difficult political positions that, and I think that's somehow to move around is the only way to blur the boundary. And then listening dramaturgy and corrective dramaturgy, if I may say that, and this is Charlene and Ness suggesting in the teachings, and I think it's as a dramaturgy of cultural and embodied histories. And this is also the happening in the performance study, early performance studies discourse, that the early discourse in performance studies have proclaimed that research on the performing arts in Asia should be theorized, whereas researchers based in Asia criticize performance studies scholars for their lack of interest in the specific cultural histories, traditions, and milieux that vitalize and give meaning to the local context and historical details of performance. And then this tension is also, yes, partly solved and partly still ongoing. But my aim is to legitimize the invocation of aging in the realm of culture and history, thereby reconceptualizing the historicizations of dance culture and the culturalizations of dance history. So that's my own interest and how I can do listening dramaturgy or corrective dramaturgy together with artists in the project. So this idea was not really original, but it's already said by Rustam Baruch's book in 1993, Theater and the World. He also gave a keynote speech at the ADN conference in Jogja, I think. And he also mentions that the intracultural approach as opposed to intercultural approach. Well, but in his case, like he calls some Euro-American theater directors like Peter Brook or Richard Schechner as interculturalists, that they kind of, yes, they dehistoricize Indian culture and to borrow other cultures to strengthen their own visions. That's what he wrote. And so instead he proposes intracultural possibility of exploring Indian culture. And yes. So I think reflecting on that, my intracultural and intergenerational approach in dance would be maybe like this, the 2 points I mentioned. So in dance, the intracultural approach allows me to establish myself somewhere between European dramaturgical tradition and the Asian cultural tradition. So performing arts categories are different, and constructions of dance is also diverse in each district, so that I have to kind of refer to the European context, but at the same time, I come back to the dance traditions, what it means to be movement, what the movement means, or what dance movement means. So I kind of like keep coming and going in between. And also as a traveling physically, now it's more difficult, but I used to be traveling a lot. And as a traveling female dance dramaturg, my position is constantly changing between historical and cultural constellations, and especially in terms of age and gender. And I also realized that the age plays very important and also critical role in Asian culture. Well, I don't know if I may call it as Asian, but some of the traditional Japanese theater communities. And seniority system is actually the kind of director-actor systems. So I think Rustom says the big mother, big father plays a role of directors. And in a way that the seniors have a big power. And also it's related to the gender. So I, as a female dramaturg, get into that kind of art or theater or dance making. That means that could be a very critical moment. And I play with it. Sometimes it's more difficult to work, but sometimes I play with these ideas of my identities. And the last point that I want to make is instead of being a choreographer in a modernist sense, I position myself as a dramaturg, dance dramaturg, and who will never become an author, but will share and negotiate what the future becomes. So I have no authorship. I have no copyright of the piece. And that's actually, I think that people understand that. But at the same time, the ideas of authorship is now really heavy ideas, and that is almost crushing what art making is supposed to be, especially in the European context. And now, like I think maybe release to be free from authorship idea is maybe the possibilities to be a dramaturg, and maybe that's something that we can get into as with a dramaturgical thinking. And I'm still kind of thinking, and yes, it's an ongoing ideas of my dramaturgy. But that's my reflection to the part of Inter. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nanako. Wow, I'm still soaking all this in, the 3 presentations that people have just shared. I think, Nanako, what really struck me is I think a lot of the language that feels very familiar with feminist ethnography, when you talk about the native informant or the expert and moving between these sites. I think one of the big radicalities of what it means to be a feminist ethnographer is standpoint theory, that you write from where you are located, and from this deep personal experience with the community you are embedded within, and that there is a lot of mobility involved, that you work within a community, and then maybe you travel some distance away to reflect and to write and to digest, what has taken place within the environment. And I think it's really profound to think about intergenerational mobilities. And I would love to ask, I would probably ask a bit about that later. But I think as a whole, what strikes me about all 3 presentations, which I think really wove together quite in a quite lovely way, is I think recurring ideas of moving between, of mobility, different kinds of mobilities, and of porosities, that there are certain gaps or spaces, not necessarily gaps, maybe spaces that we inhabit very differently in each context. And that part of the mapping is also mapping what is constantly moving or that is constantly mobile, which makes it very difficult, but I think also very exciting. I was thinking about something fellow performance studies scholar Paul Ray was talking about when thinking about archipelagic performance theory, where when we navigate in an archipelago, each island or group of islands appears different depending on one's position, and that navigating involves a continuous reorienting in relation to multiple changing directions, speeds, and positions. And it really feels like this is what the 3 presentations have been doing, like a reckoning with all of these different mobilities. So I'm just gonna maybe start by asking each presenter a question to maybe kick us off. And then after that, I think feel free to ask each other questions. I feel like all your work really resonated with each other's. And at this point, I think because we have a little bit of time, I could also maybe invite the audience to start thinking about what you might want to ask, whether about what you shared or what intersects with your practice. And again, you can type that in the chat. And then I'll kind of look through and collate the questions as we go along. But maybe we'll start with a question for Peter. And I've been thinking a lot about mapping in this new digital terrain during the pandemic. And Peter's grinning. And I had two main questions, I think. I think one is that the speed, like I mentioned, of this terrain changes so quickly. And then how does mapping then not become quickly obsolete? You know, are we always trying to map what is already gone? And then I think, yeah, maybe we'll start with that and how, maybe taking on from Paul's question, how does mapping account for those whose mobility might not be so smooth or might not be able to so easily move or travel? Yeah, Peter, any first responses?
Thank you. It's so. Firstly, I think responding to these questions is incredibly difficult because we're all still in the middle of something, and I don't know where the ends of it will be. And I think that we should, and there will be many ends. The ends are already multiple, and people experience the pandemic very differently in different places, and so it's hard to make a set of comments that apply evenly in different places. But one thing, and it's a very prosaic thing, is that many people report that their understanding of mapping becomes much smaller, in the sense that mostly people who are in lockdown walk their neighborhood in a kind of almost pre-modern way. So in a city like New York, where we're constantly running around, suddenly we're forced to negotiate a very, very local area, and perhaps even negotiate it in ways that we didn't do in the past, like discover places that are open, that you can, as Ness said, that you can buy the food that you need, or but also in a sense the kind of sensory immersion of the city stops in a way that makes you much more attentive to very small things. I think one aspect of this is the smallness of the mapping, the possibility for very local, kind of almost psychogeographies to unfold. The second thing is the global nature of this, and I'm very unsure of the revolution of Zoom. It enables us, for example, to have this discussion that we're having now across so many times and places, but it does so in a very flattened way. Technically, what's happening is that all of our presences are being reduced in a technical way in order to make the kind of bandwidth. So there's a kind of, I mean, this factor of the loss of bandwidth, I think, is something we need to think about in more critically than we have done in the past. I'm also, Nanako was pointing to the importance of generations, and in my teaching, I've had quite a few conversations with students where we have a totally different reaction to this kind of space, where I'm posing questions that graduate students just don't see as a problem. So I acknowledge the fact that there are different relationships to the technology itself. More generally, I think we need to think about this, the space-time of the pandemic, which, although it's experienced very differently across geopolitical and economic and class, race, gender lines, it's also made for a certain kind of flatness in space and time that I think is actually quite difficult to think about, because I've often quipped that it's the perfect neoliberal economy in a way, because it flattens everything and reduces everything to a certain kind of myth of sameness. So we've all got the same space on our square here, but our lives are very different. So, and that's not brought to the foreground in this kind of digital mapping that we're doing. So although it creates possibilities for conversations, and certainly a lot of my colleague Frank Henschke has been doing, runs the Siegel Center at the Graduate Center and produces public programming on performing arts. And during the pandemic, he produced a huge amount of talks with artists from all around the world about Corona in the time, theatre in the time of Corona. And he concluded last week with a 24-hour marathon, which was done in partnership with a group of theatre makers and scholars in India. And they literally performed their discourse in the time of Corona for 24 hours. And they went all around the world. There were people from pretty much the only place they didn't have a voice from was Antarctica. So, that's of course something that's only possible in this time. But at the same time, I think there are other things that we need to bring into the conversation and think about as well.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, paying attention to the hyperlocal, but also the flatness of the space. I think next I'd like to turn to Ness, and I think a lot about how you are also maybe in a different kind of mobility where you've been in Japan for some time now, and the Philippines is so close and yet so far at the same time. And I was wondering, in this location, what have your, if we think about something like Asia's method that you brought up, which was written by the Taiwanese cultural studies scholar Chen Guanxin, and he thinks through how we can start building a network of taking each other as reference points, or a critical syncretism, is how he puts it, that we pay attention to each other and to our neighbors and build these kinds of relationships of interreferencing. And I'm curious about whether your vocabularies across languages even, how they've expanded during this time or shrunk, or if there are new additions to how you make sense of this kind of interreferencing.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been really a strange time for me, because when I left Manila, I kind of anticipated that I will be disconnected from the local scene happening there. But that didn't happen. So I actually found myself working in productions back home, taking part in projects in the Philippines, based in the Philippines. And so really my especially during the time of lockdown also in Japan, like my idea of space was really warped, because I just arrived. I felt like I just arrived and I haven't really explored around my actual area. And I was spending so much time online, and my friends and my family was spending so much time online. So I kind of had this weird relationship with space. And also now thinking through this referencing within the region. So actually this is a big question that I have, because I'm like the dramaturg's nightmare. I'm directing a piece. I'm co-directing a piece for Tokyo Festival. So they invited me to co-direct a piece, inviting performers across Asia through an open call. And so we received a lot of applications from Asia. And we're still going to devise the piece in September and then perform it in October. We don't know if it's going to be a physical performance in Tokyo, if they can get their visas and they can come in, or if it's going to be an online performance. But yeah, so I'm also thinking, I'm just really thinking through this, like for example, even through the open call, we really tried our best to disseminate this open call. Like we're looking for performers from Asia or all across Asia, but we just got responses from PD areas that were near Japan, right? So this kind of already limits the kind of inter-Asia that I can interact with in this project. So I hope that as I go through this project, making this performance leading up to October, I will have more thoughts or answers to these questions.
Yeah, I think it really strikes me that these kind of collaborations become also, like what Peter said, very hyper translocal, that you are connecting from very, very specific points and very specific contexts. Thank you so much, Ness. And then finally, I see there are already kind of comments and responses coming in, but maybe one final question for Nanako. I'm really I think you mentioned the kind of intergenerational work that you do, and you alluded to this a little bit. I'm so curious and thinking about hierarchies or seniority. And it really feels like I mentioned a bit of this intergenerational mobility, that you almost have to travel between age groups as well, not just traveling between sites. And I was wondering how you might, as this traveling dramaturg, also navigate the challenges or the hierarchies of age seniority. Like, how is that navigated in a rehearsal space for you in the work that you've done?
Thank you. That's difficult questions, and also the actually ongoing task that I'm managing in Japanese context. Well, yes, I think it's more about the timing and conversations and info, like how much we see, or how. I think the way of communications, or maybe like only not only through a certain age group, but also through the group who tends to be very quiet. And so like I kind of have already asked some kind of, not assignment, but somehow request already, so that they don't feel, they don't feel that they are underrepresented also. So that somehow before we really meet each other, I kind of not design, but just like I ask them beforehand, so that in a way that this assignment or this request makes them feel much better to be together in the same space. And I think that maybe I don't know, I'm still struggling to do this, and sometimes it could be too much, and it could be I don't know, more organic. It maybe like the things are more like going to be in a group dynamics in an organic way. But then, but at the same time, there are some constellation that I have to be prepared. And how much I talk, how much I ask, yeah, probably those things.
Yeah, I think this really kind of speaks back to what you mentioned of Charlene's work, that kind of active listening or sensing of a place, and knowing when might be a time to interject, and then when to have restraint. And that can really depend on the feeling in the room, which I think must be extraordinarily difficult online also. I'm just thinking about the many online rehearsals that many people in this room must have had to try to listen between screens or between mediations like Ness was talking about. And maybe people can also share about that experience later. Thank you so much for those quick responses. There is a kind of response here from Hao Nian. Thanks, Hao Nian. So he says, one thought that strikes me is that as much as there is focus on mapping, RE, the big picture, he is now drawn to notions of positionality, locating one's dramaturgical practice, pinpointing what we do, where we are as individual dramaturgs and artists. And all three of our very illustrious speakers tonight, all of you highlighted this in different ways in your presentation. So looking at planes or nodes or coordinates or positions. I think Nanako has spoken a little bit about how she cites herself as a dramaturg and her moving proximity. But maybe to change this into a bit of a question, I'm curious about how maybe Nanako can talk a little bit more about that, and also Peter and Ness. I'm curious what this locating and this specificity might look like in your own practice as dramaturgs, whether reflecting on it now or how that has evolved over the time you've been practicing as dramaturgs.
I think maybe like so maybe I start. When I was working in Germany or outside of my countries, some of the projects are connected to the cultural traditions or cultural identities. And then in a way that I have to be a native informant, or kind of I have to translate my own cultures to the people who are not familiar with my own cultures. And that's also the translator's role. Probably cultural translations and negotiations are happening all the time in my dramaturgical work. But when I come back to my own locations or kind of local communities, I don't have to do that at some point. But at the same time, like in the Japanese performing arts, like each communities are independent. So the traditions are not shared with the contemporary theater artists. So that sometimes like I need to do kind of similar work, but it's not really native informant, but more like a expert, or not expert, but still like some kind of translating information is necessary. And this is, I think this is not only about the intercontinental, interculture, but also intracultural or intra, how do you say, disciplinary or intra-community, can I say. So I think it also depends on the countries to countries, and probably like the different countries has a different cultural constellations, and then Japan has a very specific structures of performing arts. So I think that may be, that may be different in other contexts too.
Thank you so much. Peter and Ness, any thoughts or responses to Nanako?
Yes, the answers are for me always yes and no to the idea of dramaturgy. I think is always about very specific and local contexts. It always takes us to a very particular set of questions and a very particular set of situations. But we also work on a variety of projects that take us into very different arrangements. So the two projects that I've worked on most recently, on the one that involves a Korean traditional musician and a Japanese New York-based performance maker / visual artist, and it involves a collaboration around music, projection, and some classical texts from the Korean and Japanese poetic traditions around the theme of emotions. So it's more of a kind of visual performance piece with a music score. But obviously there's a really interesting set of complicated negotiations that take place in that working process. And my role is very much somebody who mediates in a way between working as an outside eye to as perhaps somebody also who is more experienced theatre maker than the other people as well, to bring a kind of theatrical, a structural eye to that work. The participants have a very strong sense of what they want to do, but the question is how to do it. And so, my role can be quite technical there and quite structural. But a very different project that I worked on is a series of filmic essays with the visual artist Alexis de Soup, which are based around the changing ecological, geopolitical space of the Arctic Circle, and particularly on the border of Finland and Russia. And there I'm working with somebody who has a long history as a really exceptionally strong visual artist, and somebody who goes to communities and makes stories out of collecting sources of stories from those communities. And that was an interesting project for me, because I was initially come on board because he was thinking of using his confidence as actors, and I was just simply going to come on and kind of direct the actors, the non-professional artists. But in fact, we ended up writing a whole kind of textual score for the piece, and so the work in a sense became more traditionally dramaturgical. But that challenge for me was to think much in terms of a very geopolitical and historical situation, but also in relation to the primacy of visual culture, and the fact that the medium of this work was an extraordinarily powerful visual arts work. So that took me way out of my experience as a dramaturg, and I was less kind of in negotiation of intracultural or intercultural, and much more into a negotiation between forms.
Thanks, Peter. Ness, did you have anything you wanted to add to it? I realize we're getting on time, so I wanted to open it up to the floor after Ness responds, if anyone else has any questions or comments. But yes, Ness, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe just I can actually resonate with what Peter said. When I think of my position as a dramaturg, I don't really think of like where I'm, like my location. But more of recently I've been thinking of my position as a mediator or translator between different mediums or different disciplines, maybe because of my background where I started as an actor, and then I studied literature, and then after that I became a teacher, and then I worked in communities, I work with scientists, I work with different sorts of people. And then now in grad school, because the university I am in is heavily focused on visual arts, even though my own research is still in performance. And so I also get exposed to visual arts theories. And so I kind of move between these different languages and different ways of meaning making. So this is why I feel like, especially when working in contemporary performance work, or like just projects, like community-based projects, I'm always kind of translating between these different aesthetics or meaning-making processes and languages between the collaborators and audiences. Yeah, so that's how I kind of position myself recently.
Thank you very much. It feels like there's a lot of shape-shifting that comes with dramaturgy. And I really do think that in thinking about mediating and the that a lot of being an intermediary really is part of the interface of being a dramaturg. So I'm curious if any of our audience here, ADN friends, other practitioners, if you have any questions for our three panelists to respond to anything you wanted to bring up about what's been discussed. And you can either chat or you can unmute yourself and also speak directly if that's easier for you. Anyone? Okay, I'll ask, I'm actually really curious to follow up on what Nanako brought up on authorship. I think there's a thread we haven't quite unraveled yet. And I'm very curious what Peter and Ness think about this notion of removing oneself from authorship of a work. I think very much in literature, we think of singular authorship, but I think now there are much more pivots or transitions to collaborative authorship. So I'm very curious what Peter and Ness might think about that.
Maybe I can.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I really resonated. I like wrote a huge like authorship on my paper because this release from authorship is something that I want to happen. Like when I mentioned that I feel like directing is like a dramaturg's nightmare, because it really does. I feel so uncomfortable being in the room and like having this like position stamped upon me, especially in a kind of in a devising setting. And I don't know what else I wanted to say, but just wanted to say that I resonated so much with, like, there's an emotional impact to that phrase that I immediately like held on to when Nanako said that.
Yeah, Nanako, go for it.
Sorry, I just come up with the questions. So what kind of role are you supposed to do when someone asks you to be a director? And I'm curious because there are many things to do, but at the same time, there's something that they specifically want you to do. Maybe can you explain to me?
Thank you. So I think what's interesting also in this project is I have a co-director, so they paired us. I'm paired with a choreographer whose background is actually in visual arts. So he's a sculptor, and then he started using his own body as a sculpture, and so that's how he started doing dance. And so his vocabulary also is not really from dance or theater, but from visual arts. And then together, we were kind of given a grant to produce work. So that's basically, that's it. But I guess also because I'm working with a co-director, then I also have to negotiate what the director means. And of course, my collaborator also has his own ideas of what this word means, right? And so I think for me, the constant struggle is kind of reminding myself that I'm not just here to support him, but I'm actually here to be offering more strongly. Actually, I don't know, this is a good, what do you guys think? But anyway, so this is a problem because sometimes I feel like I leave the rehearsal room and I'm really happy, but then sometimes I think maybe I should have been more insistent a little bit. Like maybe I was prodding too much about what he thinks and not offering too much about what I think. But I don't know yet. So I'm really looking forward to the rehearsals when our collaborators will come in, because right now it's just two of us and we just finished screening our final list of performers. So I hope that when there are more people in the room, maybe I will find out what being a director means for me in this project with more people in the room, maybe.
Thanks for sharing that, Ness. I think Charlene, Charlene has a response, but I wonder if you wanted to pose it yourself, or you want me to read it. Charlene, go for it.
No, yeah, just to make the link between what is being said and this tension and this conflict with leadership and notions of leadership that are not just a top-down structure, but the work of sense-making is now entering the discourses of leadership. And the dramaturg is one who has been doing this for a long time, or people doing dramaturgical thinking have been involved in sense-making, which is a much more horizontal way of working rather than a vertical way of working. And of course, then the word authority and the absence of the author or authorship that places a certain kind of rigid expectation on how to work rather than a creative expectation. I mean, the author is also a creative being, like, the author creator, which is not so, I suppose, it doesn't then contradict so much of what I feel Ness is talking about, which is a capacity to work more fluidly or flexibly and with greater nuance, right? Because at the end of the day, there's a certain kind of leadership that's needed as well, a certain kind of directorial process that is needed as well. But how to then navigate this with the opening up of other possibilities.
Yeah, thank you, Charlene, for sharing that. I think we have another question from Ralph. Did you want me to read it out, or did you want to kind of post it yourself?
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello. I'm Ness's husband, actually. I'm a visual artist. So yeah, I'm just gonna read my question. So I'm seeing trends of art projects or socially engaged art or interdisciplinary projects. So not necessarily performance, having dramaturgs either needing needing dramaturgs or gaining from dramaturgs or dramaturgy. So as a visual artist and participatory art practitioner, I'm curious about what you think about this. Does it have something to do with dramaturgy developing in Asia or like contemporary trends or whatever? So yeah.
Thanks for that. Peter, did you want to respond to this perhaps?
Sure. I think it's a really interesting question that you're asking, and it's, for me anyway, I think it's, we are looking at a need to think more closely about the shared understanding of practice between curators and dramaturgs. When we think about what curators have been doing in the last 2 decades, not just in Western institutional contexts, but I think very in pioneering ways in many of the Asian contexts and in other parts of the world. We see a really strong sense of interplay between the practices, but we also see some emerging challenges because in many places, and this is not an exclusive comment, but in many places, visual arts have a stronger place in the cultural economy of the nation. They have more resources sometimes. So we often see a kind of freedom to appropriate the performing arts in the visual arts context in more recent times without supporting the work of the artists adequately. I think, I don't know, I can't speak for all dramaturgs, but I've been working more in the visual arts space, and it's beholden to me to become more aware of histories and vocabularies of visual arts as a result. One of my beefs, if you like, is that when I see performance in visual arts contexts, it's not well presented, it's not well looked after. And I think that there's a learning curve that needs to take place there. I think there are some really notable exceptions of this, where there has been very good curatorial practice, and this is specifically in relation to the rising interest in having contemporary dance and other forms of social practice-based performance in visual arts contexts. And so it's a very new area, I think, and it's an area that will only grow in its interest for us. But we with my colleague Bertie Ferdman and I recently did a book on this question where we interviewed a whole lot of cultural practitioners working across these spaces, and so many times the questions that they're facing and the practices that they're engaged in have a lot of common points, and there could be a much stronger conversation between the two fields. So that's, yeah, I think it's exciting, that potential.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm aware we're getting on time, and it always feels like this that the conversation is only just beginning, but I really appreciate thinking about other homologous practices in other disciplines. You brought up the figure of the curator, and I think many other scholars who work in this field have also been thinking about theorizing curatorial practice very similarly to dramaturgy almost, as the intermediary figure between public, artist, state even. So I think that's a very interesting note to kind of maybe segue this from. But I think I'm so glad that we got to hear from everyone today. And it's so interesting, how we've traveled, I think, across the past 5 years. And this is really just volume 1. There's so much more material that ADN and the editors are working on putting out into the world. But I think about, I guess we've moved from the earlier kind of offerings of vocabulary, just thinking back to the 2016 symposium, where we were really just kind of offering categories or trying to think around certain words across languages. And now it feels like that now that there is kind of a critical mass of vocabulary, we're poking at certain terms or contesting certain things, rethinking certain ideas. And that feels quite nice as a reflection point, quite a few years on, some distance to think about how ADN has grown over the past 5 years. So I think this was a really nice, reflective stock take, and really appreciate Peter, Ness, and Nanako bringing their practices into the room and sharing them with all of us. And thank you everyone too for taking part in this conversation. I'm just going to pass this back to Charlene and the Center 42 team. I think they have a few quick announcements and other things they wanted to add.